Nobody hurts my horse.
What makes a movie a Western? Is the answer as simple as a period piece? With a specific setting? Specific costumes and characters? Cowboys, Indians, outlaws, and gunfights? Or is it more complex than that? Most consider the Western genre to be a very broad spectrum of different types of films that have a wide range of subgenres. In this sense, Western just becomes the setting. When we call something a horror Western, a Western comedy, or a sci-fi Western, we seem to just be watching a horror, comedy, or sci-fi movie with a different type of window dressing. If we're looking for a consensus definition for Westerns, Wikipedia is a good place to start. It is in no way ever to be considered actual research, but it's always a good start to get an overview on a topic before you go down a rabbit hole. Okay, from Wikipedia, Western is a genre. The Western is a genre of fiction typically set in the 19th or early 20th century in the Western United States, commonly referred to as the Old West or Wild West, and depicted in Western media as hostile, sparsely populated frontier in a state of near total lawlessness, patrolled by outlaws, sheriffs, and numerous other stock gunslinger characters. Western narratives commonly concern the gradual attempts to settle and civilize the untamed and crime-ridden American West, often in service of wider themes of justice, freedom, manifest destiny, and the national history and identity of the United States. Stories commonly center on the life of a nomadic, male, white American drifter, cowboy or gunfighter who rides a horse and is armed with a revolver and/or a rifle. The male characters typically wear broad-brimmed and high-crowned Stetson hats, neckerchief bandanas, vests, and cowboy boots with spurs. While many wear convention shirts and trousers, alternatives include buckskins and dusters. Women are generally cast in secondary roles as romantic interest for the male lead, or in supporting roles as saloon girls, prostitutes, or as the wives of pioneers and settlers. The wife character often provides a measure of comic relief. Other recurring characters include Native Americans of various tribes, African Americans, Mexicans, lawmen, bounty hunters, outlaws, bartenders, traders, gamblers, soldiers, especially mounted cavalry, pioneers and settlers, farmers, ranchers, and townsfolk. The ambiance is usually punctuated with a Western music score, including American folk music, Spanish and Mexican folk music, such as country, Native American music, New Mexico music, and rancheras. Characteristics. The American Film Institute defines Western films as those set in the American West that embody the spirit, the struggle, and the demise of the new frontier. The term Western, used to describe a narrative film genre, appears to have originated with a July 1912 article in Motion Picture World magazine. Most of the characteristics of Western films were part of the 19th century popular Western fiction, and were firmly in place before film became a popular art form. Western films commonly feature protagonists such as cowboys, gunslingers, and bounty hunters, who are often depicted as semi-nomadic wanderers who wear Stetson hats, bandanas, spurs, and buckskins, use revolvers or rifles as everyday tools of survival and as a means to settle disputes using frontier justice. Protagonists ride between dusty towns and cattle ranches on their trusty steeds. If we're looking for a deeper definition of what makes a Western, I think the closest we're going to get to that from Wikipedia is the idea of frontier justice. Wikipedia goes on to say the typical things about a white male protagonist in a Stetson hat, bald types and crimes against the Native Americans, but Bone Tomahawk definitely flipped that one around a bit. It's true to say that most Western films from the golden era of the 1950s and 60s were not kind to other cultures. It is, however, hard to find a protagonist in any of these movies that treats anyone but the villain that way. Sure, there may be conflict between the races, but go watch 48 Hours, then talk to me about racial conflict. A great example of this is the 1971 movie Red Sun with Charles Bronson and Toshiro Mifune. Yes, that Toshiro Mifune. The Leonardo DiCaprio to Kurosawa's Scorsese. Red Sun highlights a lot of racial misunderstandings, but the resolution is satisfying, considering Asians treated Americans the same in their setting. It's also important to note that the frontier justice we see in Westerns is no different than the way they always bend the law in buddy cop movies. like 48 Hours. Revenge is another reoccurring theme in westerns. This was usually a theme with spaghetti westerns, and most of the films that Clint Eastwood did with Sergio Leone. Revenge westerns are just more violent versions of the idea of frontier justice. The violence is justified by how much we're able to relate with the protagonists. The movie playing in the background now is The Quick and the Dead, a Sam Raimi film from the 90s. It's campy, but it's one of my favorite revenge movies. I'm not going to talk about it because I want you to experience it for yourself. What I do want to talk about is what inspired me to make this video. Recently, someone close to me reintroduced me to a movie that I hadn't seen in ages and only ever saw once. The 2004 film Hidalgo, starring Viggo Mortensen. Just a little aside about Viggo, how cool is this guy? Dude's made music with Buckethead. He plays Frank Hopkins, who is a real-life cowboy born in the 19th century. But the real main character of this movie is Hidalgo, Frank's Mustang. It's amazing how expressive this animal is on camera. The movie sets up Frank's character, then introduces us to Wild Bill and his traveling show, which Frank was a part of. Frank spends his days drinking away the guilt he feels for his part in the massacre of Wounded Knee. Though we begin in a Wild West setting, most of this movie takes place in the Arabian desert, so then why does it still feel like a Western the whole way through? It's not just the horses, that's for sure. The plot of this movie is centered around a long-distance horse race sponsored by Arab horse breeders, in which Frank enters his horse to compete against much purer bloodlines. There's a whole genetic purity subplot here that we won't even dare to touch, but it's definitely there. The reason this movie feels like a Western is Frank's self-will and self-reliance. He has solid morals, is honorable and trustworthy. He proves this several times in the film, despite all his flaws. He even dishes out frontier justice. Frontier justice that we, the audience, can get behind anytime. The main thing holding this movie back, other than a Disney-like washing of any controversy throughout, is the bad CGI effects at times. The sandstorm scene being the one I'm reminded of the most. But for all its bad CGI, Hidalgo had great practical effects. Great stunt work too. And much respect to the people that worked and trained the horses. Rugged individualism is the quality we look for in our Western protagonists. This rugged individualism represents the American spirit and our thirst for freedom. In the frontier of the early American West, the individual man was responsible to be the judge and the jury themselves, and sometimes even the executioner. It's because of this rugged individualistic spirit that we can stretch the genre of Western to include things like the cult classic sci-fi TV show Firefly, created by Joss Whedon. So I think the answer to the question, what is a Western, must be about the will of the protagonist. Of course, there are anti-heroes that blur the lines, but Western movies more often than not contain a highly moral hero as the main character. When I say highly moral, I mean the character strongly believes in their own morals. These are always subjective, but the more we can relate, the more memorable and loved the characters become. Like this one. And this one. And this one. And okay, these ones too.